Hey guys, what is up? I'm Swim and this is my stream, and today we're talking balance changes. So I wanted to make this a few days ago, but I was at the time of the balance patch participating in the Seat Story Cup tournament, and basically Valve dropped in the middle of the tournament a pretty major balance patch, only changing a few cards, but changing really key cards. And I wanted to kind of cover my thoughts on the changes in this video, what things that they're going to affect, basically whether the cards are still going to be good or bad, and whether these changes are kind of overall healthy. I want to kind of focus mostly on the kind of non-direct or indirect changes of these, because, you know, in any complex game, if you buff one thing, a lot of things that are kind of attached to that one thing get nerfed or buffed depending on kind of the relationship they're in, that aren't necessarily super obvious at first. Quick note, I'm only going to be talking about gameplay in this video, meta predictions, balance changes, etc. They dropped some progression stuff in this video. I haven't got enough time to kind of mess around with that or develop opinions on it yet. I don't want this video to be gameplay oriented. So change number 1. Axe, everybody's favorite red hero, got nerfed down to 6 to 10 instead of 7 to 11. So this is a pretty big nerf to red as a color. Axe was auto-include, one of the, auto-include heroes in the game, and it's healthy, therefore, that he got nerfed. This does, however, change how red is to be played a little bit. The big question is, do you still run Axe? The answer to this is probably yes, although there might be some decks that can kind of think about cutting him. For example, in the Seat Story Cup, in the second day after the kind of balance changes were done, 6-0 changed his Axe out of his aggro style list for Pugna to try to count him on a blue. It didn't necessarily work that well, although the idea and some similar ideas for like Axe cuts definitely require some experimentation. One thing is for sure though, Axe is going to see experimental cuts. Red is going to see less play in general. And the most interesting thing about this change is Axe might no longer be a flop hero, depending on the deck. Most commonly right now, the way to play Axe is in the river slot, the 3rd round deployment slot, because his 6 attack just doesn't really kill as much anymore. This is really key, by the way. It looks like you're just losing 1 damage per turn, right? Off of the difference between 6 and 7 attack, but it's huge. Very huge, because your attack with red heroes is how you're supposed to lock the opponent out of play options, right? Like when it's mana 5, mana 6, mana 7, and it passes to you on initiative into a new lane, you have 7 attack, you use Duel or Berserker's Call, and that 1 attack is going to allow you to have a higher threshold in terms of what heroes you can lock out of playing cards, right? This is not just 1 damage, which is really key, because a lot of heroes have 7 health, right? Drow Ranger, Ogre, Magi, Zeus. There's a ton of heroes in the game that Axe can kind of no longer one-shot, and that really hurts the hero. So overall, great change. It's more of a nerf to red as a color than it is a nerf to Axe in particular, because Axe is still going to be run in, it looks right now like most red decks, but it's still going to be very healthy for the game moving forward. Next up, Bloodseeker. Base stats changed from 7-6 to 7-7, and Blood Rage mana cost from 5 to 4. Now, I was really excited to see this, mostly because it's Valve showing that they're not only going to just nerf, overpowered heroes, but they're also going to buff underpowered ones. Bloodseeker is one of the weakest heroes in the game. There was kind of no reason to play him over Debbie, and now it feels a little bit better. The base stat is really important, the 1 extra piece of health, because 6 is a major range for stuff at any cost. Even Berserker's Call off of Axe, now that he has 6 attack, will survive against Bloodseeker, and it's even more important with him because his passive allows him to heal fully every time unless he's killed, and so that extra little bit of survivability goes further with him based on that passive than other heroes. And of course, the Blood Rage, will allow you. It's a better card now. I mean, it was always kind of overpriced at 5. So overall, it feels more like you can look at Bloodseeker as a hero, but I still do not see this hero as being competitive, even experimentally. Notably because of Jasper Daggers, a card we will cover down in a little bit. Next up, we have Cheating Death, everybody's favorite card. So Cheating Death got a full rework, mana cost changed from 5 to 4, and now it basically, instead of doing what it did before, it gives you an active. You can, once a turn, use it and give a unit death shield this round. but you can only do this if you have a green hero in the lane. So it's interesting. It very functionally changes the card in a way that I'm honestly not sure I like. So a very common suggestion that I saw a lot tossed among players and on Reddit, I actually saw this comment several times, was to basically just make Cheating Death's ability visible, like you know what's going to die or not. And the way to implement that would have been kind of keeping the card the same, but making it at the start of the action phase, or even the start of the round, it applies, Death Shield randomly to 50% chance on each unit in the lane for that turn. And in doing so, you're not going to waste removal into them. They're never going to be able to survive more than one thing in a turn at very most, but it's still going to kind of be able to preemptively counter cards like Annihilation and other board clear effects, right? So they've reworked it entirely, right? Now it's no longer kind of this anti-blue card. Now it's more of it's kind of a draft card, maybe? It's sort of like a combo piece for, the Slacks type memes with like the Bracers of Sacrifice, maybe Ravenous Mass. You can kind of use these tools more reliably, and that's very cool, but I do think that Cheating Death had, in some way, a healthy aspect to it. I want to be very clear about this, actually. Cheating Death was a card that was designed kind of horribly, but there was one aspect of it, which was it was kind of the sole counter to blue without initiative in the entire game, right? Because there's two ways to deal with Annihilation if you don't have initiative, and those are Cheating Death and Glyph of Confusion. And of course, Glyph of Confusion is just a blue card, right? We saw that perform very, very well in Sea Story. But without Cheating Death kind of being able to fulfill this role, Cheating Death was almost Green's initiative card in a way, if you want to think about it like that. Because Green doesn't have initiative cards, and Cheating Death doesn't give you initiative, but it kind of makes initiative not matter because it allows you to proactively block removal even when you don't have initiative, right? And I probably would have preferred to see a redesign of how it selected targets or how it triggered, rather than a redesign towards like the concept of that the card was kind of supposed to be, right? Because now we're kind of entering this meta where, maybe blue is kind of too strong of a color, right? Cheating Death was a pretty large thing, I think, holding it back. Because, blue doesn't really have a great way to remove the improvement, and it really, really kind of stops Annihilation at its track. Without it, it feels like blue might potentially overtake the meta. Overall, I'd say I'm happy they nerfed Cheating Death. Obviously, the card did need to be dealt with in some way, but I personally feel like it could have been done in a different way. Or potentially maybe like alongside other nerfs that, were able to kind of counterbalance this effect, right? It's really important to understand that a card game meta is like an ecosystem, right? In biology, if you take away, one of the natural predators of something, right, then it can kind of snowball, that something can kind of snowball out of control without that anymore in a way that's potentially maybe even more unhealthy than, the initial predator was. It's difficult to say, and we'll have to see how this plays out. Next up, the change to Drow Ranger. So Drow, Green's auto-include cards, and one of the reasons to play Green alongside Cheating Death, now is changed to Gust is now silence an enemy hero and its allied neighbors this round. So this is a lot worse of a card. It's actually pretty incredibly worse. If you look at this, a lot of people might still think, oh, you still got the passive. Oh, you're still going to be able to silence some stuff for 4 mana. It's still a better silence than Rick's. A much better silence than Rick's. You can look at this in all those ways. But in reality, if you're not silencing the entire enemy board, and sometimes you still can. Sometimes there's going to be a board state where the 2 enemy heroes on that lane are adjacent. It's not really going to do that much of anything for an entire card, right? Silences are kind of weak effects in Artifact, right? Now, Gust was a really strong effect, but the other silences we had in the forms of like Bloodseeker and Rix were kind of bad. Not really because they were overcosted at 5 mana, but because they only silenced one thing. If you're only going to silence one hero, you're not really doing that much, right? And another really key thing about this version of Gust is you can't even target a creep, right? So if there's one creep between two heroes, you can't even silence both heroes, which means, you still have the ability to use 4 mana to lock them out of a color, but you're only going to be able to lock them out of one color. They'll still have play options, and that's a really, really big deal because, the whole point of Gust was, and this is why it was OP, but the whole point of Gust was, just lock the opponent out of play options that turn. So Drow is now, I would say, a competitively playable card. It looks like the best green-red decks right now are cutting her. But honestly, again, just as the nerf to Axe was more of a nerf to red than it was a nerf to Axe, because, when you look at the color representation, Axe is kind of still being played. It's just red. Maybe you have less of a reason to run red, right? You look at Drow and green. Well, Drow might go from decks, but then at that point, Cheating Death is gone, Drow is gone. What's the point of running green, right? Green right now is looking to be a really, really weak color in Constructed at the moment. Of course, it's still great in Draft, but that's a different story. In Constructed, there's almost no reason to run it. Stars Align is still something that can, maybe ramp into something on a high roll. Red Green Ramp is still going to be a deck. I think it is no longer a tier 1 deck. It's going to be hard to say kind of how it pans out. I would personally put Red Green right now as a low tier 2 deck, and I think that probably the most optimal version of that deck won't be running Drow Ranger. It'll probably be running 2 of either Treant, Omni Knight, or Lycan. And then next up, we're getting to the single most impactful change of these notes, perhaps. This is a really interesting one, and one that has a lot of both positive and negative implications. Jasper Daggers. Gold cost changed from 7 to 5, and now on equip, not only do you gain to attack and pierce, but you purge your opponent's effects from equipped hero. So this card is very powerful all of a sudden. Jasper Daggers went from seeing almost, basically no play, you wouldn't even pick this up in the side shop pretty much always, to now, wow, this is a real card. This is a card that is almost an auto-include to some level in Constructed. I think Mono Blue is a deck that can run 0 and often should run 0, but there's not really other decks that shouldn't run at very, very least one copy of this card. It is just kind of a cure-all. It solves so many different effects in the game. So the full list of what Jasper Daggers counters, and keep in mind, it can only purge your opponent's effects off of things. It cannot purge your own debuffs. So if you use something like an OD Astral Imprisonment or a Bloodseeker Silence, if you use it on your own unit, you won't be able to purge it off. If your opponent uses those on you, you will be able to purge it off. The full list of what you can purge off with this card is the passive from Beastmasters little cat. It's not a boar, by the way. You think it's a boar until you look at it closely and you're like, wow, it's a cat. It's a boar and toad. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, Beastmasters Boar, Beastmasters Roar, Bristleback's Viscous Nasal Goo. This is a big one because Bristleback's very common. Centaur's Double Edge, which they use on your heroes a lot. The negative effect from Timber's signature card. Crystal Maiden's Frostbite Disarm. Tinker's Laser Disarm. Astral and Bloodseeker, which I mentioned just now. Track from Bounty Hunter, another big one because that's very common. Winter Wyvern with the disarm of her own. The Drow Silence, the Rick Silence, the passives from both Viper and Ursa, the stuns from Tidehunter and Earthshaker, Skyrath's Concussive Shot. The list goes on, right? There's even a few more stuns that you don't really see run, like Sucker Punch and Caught Unprepared, debuffs like Home Field Advantage, which, aren't really Constructed level, but you actually see them quite a lot in Draft. So, this item is now suddenly a good scoop in Draft for sure. You pick this up right away. And then Glyph of Confusion as well, but only your opponent's glyph, not your own, which is very, very important. So this item basically instantly counters a ton of other things in the game. And it's interesting. It's a very interesting effect that we now have. It's nice to see kind of another strong item because, of course, right now item decks are a little bit stagnant, I think. I think that there's too many item decks that are just like 3 blink, 3 Stonehall Cloak, or maybe other health items, and then just like a couple of random fillers just between some minor choices, right? So it's cool to have another item to choose from, but I'm a little concerned with kind of the long-term implications that Jasper Dagger will have on the game. Predominantly, it feels like it limits a lot of these other cards from kind of seeing play, right? For example, during the Seed Story Cup, when they dropped this patch on us and we had the opportunity to resubmit the deck because they dropped a patch in the middle of the tournament, me and the rest of Team Mono Blue, the Blue Man squad with Sang and Hyped, we were thinking about cards to potentially run, right? We were thinking about trying Earthshaker. I don't like Earthshaker, but Sang and Hyped both kind of do a little. And it's like, well, can't run Earthshaker because Fissure is a stun and it gets so hard countered. I mean, the opponent sees the Earthshaker in your deck, one sort of purging, and then Fissure is just such a useless card, right? Like, and that's why you're running Earthshaker. And I was looking at the patch changes. Spoiler alert, I'm just going to say right now, a little bit down the list, OD gets +1 health, right? And it's like, ooh, that's actually really nice. OD was actually, I think, closer to viable than people thought. I experimented with him. 7 health is a really big deal for blue heroes. It's outside of the range of at any cost, which is huge because you can play at any cost and survive. I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll actually run OD for my deck in Seed Story Cup. And then I was like, oh, wait, but they can just take off the Astral Imprisonment with Jasper Daggers, and that gets a lot worse. I mean, if that happens just once in a game, my OD feels like he's accomplishing almost nothing, right? Because if I'm going to spend 4 mana to try to lock the opponent out of a play at a crucial moment, at 4 mana and a card, and then they just completely nullify that, right, by just equipping it with a 5 gold item that gives 2 attack, then why am I running OD in my deck, right? And the same is true for almost all of the cards I just mentioned on my list. Not all of them. There's definitely some of these heroes that, you're still running, like Bounty Hunter. Hey, he's still a good hero, right? You're usually tracking early. You still need him in gold decks. That's fine, right? Maybe something like Crystal Maiden. Honestly, even Crystal Maiden. Like, I feel like I'm going to get punished if I try running her in mono blue, because if the opponent has Jasper, which they often do, then her disarm in the mid game, I mean, it's still useful early, but her disarm in the mid game just feels like it loses too much value for free. And why choose a hero that gets countered by Jasper when I can choose one that doesn't? That's at the same, or at the very least, a kind of similar level, right? So it feels like Jasper Daggers has almost, in design terms, sort of a subtractive effect on the card pool for competitive viability, right? It feels like there's kind of less cards you can really consider running in your deck right now because of how Jasper Daggers is. Not only how it's designed, but how it's balanced. It's like a little too cheap. It also counters like certain armor strategies because it has the armor piercing passive. Keep in mind, this allows your heroes to punch through, Vesture, which matters a little bit, Time of Triumph, which actually could matter quite a bit because being able to pierce through the Time of Triumph armor and kill those heroes at like mana turn 9 actually makes a difference, right? Routed, that's another one. I didn't even mention that before. It kind of hurts the ability to play a lot of different cards in the game, and I think it's a little bit too cheap, right? I honestly think that a lot of people have kind of identified this at this point, and you might have heard or thought about suggestions that it should be a little bit more expensive. Like, for example, keep it 7 gold. We could try that. I'm honestly not sure exactly if that's the best solution. I'm mostly concerned with kind of the design identity here, which is basically just that it's a little bit too flexible of a card, and it kind of creates this sort of binary counter dynamic in design, right? Which is like, if they have it, it's too good. If they don't have it, it's too bad, right? Think Smash the Defenses. It's the same sort of design logic, something that hard counters one individual thing and then is just a complete brick if they don't have that thing, right? Now, Jasper Daggers is a lot more broad and a lot cheaper and a lot more neutral because, of course, it is an item and you can put it in any color of deck. And those kind of 3 things, definitely feel like they exacerbate the issue with the card, but the design is still there. It's still just kind of this binary counter design, which I'm personally not a huge proponent of in my games. Now, the most important thing to understand, though, about Jasper Daggers, because I know a common argument I've heard, you've heard, maybe you've said it, which is that, okay, if Jasper Daggers is just this automatic counter all these cards, well, then naturally these cards will be cut from lists, and then Jasper Daggers will, you'll be seeing a ton of games where it's like, why am I running Jasper Daggers if all of these cards that I'm meant to counter I'm not even queuing into? And then it'll kind of go back and forth, if you kind of get what I mean. You'll take the Jasper Daggers out, maybe some people, the meta will respond again, people will start adding these back in, and it'll kind of auto balance in that way a little bit. That's a common argument. And it can be true in some situations, but the most important thing to identify is that there's going to be some sort of kind of stabilization amount, right? There's sort of a triangle with any sort of meta counter, which is based on like 3 predominant factors, which are kind of the odds of you hitting your kind of effective tech target, like what you're trying to tech against, the odds of hitting that value, like if I'm queuing into something that requires either purge or piercing, the odds of that happening. The value if it doesn't happen, like the negative value, because I'm losing value if I don't hit that, versus the positive value if it does happen. Those are kind of the 3 most important variables in this equation. And the problem with Jasper Daggers is it creates a triangle that's very out of balance, because it's too easy to run daggers and too low risk, because it's only 5 gold, right? And even if you're hitting some deck that has no purge targets, which a lot of decks will have right now because Jasper Daggers is in the meta, piercing has a hard time not finding value, and worst case scenario, you are spending 2 extra gold for a short sword, which isn't even a bad item, really. Whereas best case scenario, you're just kind of nullifying an opponent's strategy and kind of winning the game for a very, very low cost. So basically, it's just kind of the exact variables in this like triangular equation are off such that it's going to stabilize to the point where Jasper Daggers are more common than like cutting the purgeable cards will be common, if that makes any sense. And that kind of creates this subtractive effect on the card pool, because it feels like Jasper Daggers will still be run, but you still can't feel like you run a lot of these other cards at a competitive level. It's also really important to understand how this affects like future design as well, because it's not just these cards that I mentioned, but it's also like any future positive debuffs they want to add to the game, or like some of the kind of unplayable cards that I mentioned before. Like, Tidehunter was actually kind of close to being playable. I could have seen that card being run as the card pool kind of expands. Definitely not as good as a lot of people think, Tidehunter, but I mean, he was not that far off. But now Jasper Daggers is in the game, why run Tidehunter? Because the stun is just going to get purged right off, right? So they'll definitely have to do something about this card, and I think the answer lies in maybe making it a little bit more expensive, but probably just kind of separating the purge and the pierce into 2 different cards or something like that. The problem is it kind of casts too broad of a net and is able to counter kind of too many strategies all at once. Okay, I know I just spent a ton of time talking about Jasper Daggers, so we're gonna kind of breeze through these others fairly quickly. Speaking of quickly, here's Lion. Finger of Death now has a new keyword, Quicken, which means every time you use it, it reduces the cooldown by 1, but not below 1. So you use it the first time, and then when it's off cooldown, the second time you use it, it will have a 3-turn cooldown. The third time you use it, it'll have a 2-turn cooldown, and so on until it gets to 1, and then you're using it every turn. But at this point, you're at like 15 mana, and I mean, games just don't go on this long. Practically, I think this effect does basically nothing. I mean, it's not going to matter until the game goes to like mana 11 anyway. Which, games pretty much don't go to, especially in black. I mean, black doesn't really have the stall tools. It's a very aggressive color. So it feels weird to have the Quicken keyword attached to a black hero. Probably not going to do that much in this case, but it's an interesting keyword. I'd like to see it being applied to other things. Don't play Lion. Lion's still bad. Outworld Devourer, base stats, +1 health as spoiled previously. Unfortunately, don't play OD. OD is still bad. As mentioned, survives at any cost. Big deal. I think he was an underrated hero to begin with. Blue was in some circles an underrated color last week, and of course now we're kind of seeing that shift, not just because of the nerfs, but because of the realization that mono blue was a lot better than people were giving it credit for before. At the same time, OD didn't get buffed. He got nerfed because the 1 health doesn't do as much as the Jasper Daggers does to hurt him, so don't play OD. Timbersaw, next up. Reactive armor now has an interesting side effect. Not only does Timbersaw gain 1 armor for each of its attackers, but each of Timbersaw's attackers have -1 armor. I really like this change. I think that this is a great way to buff the hero because it sends it more into this kind of synergistic niche, right? Like, if you're going to buff Timbersaw, it's good to do it in a way that forces you to kind of play for the certain condition, because now, you know, you really want to run, basically, pick a fight with Timbersaw, right? If you see that in a draft, it just kind of creates this sort of synergy, or maybe other, like, taunt cards, like Ventriloquy, or ones that they might print in the future. But basically, you have this little niche synergy, and Timbersaw is a much better draft hero now. Is he constructed level? I think probably not. The kind of Rising Anger meme deck has gotten a little bit better, because of course Whirling Death is good with Rising Anger, but right now that deck feels like it's missing too many tools and is probably not really made to be like a tier 1 constructed level deck in the first place. But the bottom line is Timbersaw is a lot better in drafts. This is a great hero to kind of just scoop up in draft right now. The fact that it kills Debbie on the flop is really, really important, because Debbie's a very, very common draft hero, and that's rare for a red hero. Before, Timbersaw was just like basically the same level as Keith, maybe a little bit better. Now, he's a good bit better than Keith. Like, you can definitely see yourself scooping up a Timbersaw and being pretty happy about it. So those are the patch changes, but now this is I think the real interesting part of the video. What indirect meta or card implications will these changes have, right? Like, for example, I mentioned green is a very weak color right now. I think there's almost no reason to play green in constructed. Green-red is probably the only sort of decent deck that runs green, and I personally just don't think that deck is on the level. I was talking with Gara. I was in his hotel room a couple nights ago, and we were up at like 4 a.m. and you know, he scrimped a ton of mono blue with green red, and it felt bad. And Gara is like a hardcore green red loyalist, and he was saying the deck just feels like trash now, right? And a lot of other green red players were kind of saying the same. We saw it get absolutely obliterated in the Seat Story Cup. I mean, everything is just pointing to the deck just not really being a super competitive deck anymore. It's just 3 nerfs back to back, right? Axe and Drow and Cheating Death. It just makes that deck not really on the level. Cheating Death was kind of carrying that deck because it fulfilled its criteria in the kind of triangle, because it was able to counter blue. Now, without the ability to even counter blue, there's not really too much of a point to play that deck right now. So basically green is a much worse color. Blue is probably the strongest color in the game. I think that was true before this patch and people weren't really respecting it. Speaking of blue, the Storm deck, the green-blue kind of Salamania Storm deck, that's basically dead now that the Drow no longer has the ability to Gust. And of course, Gust gets hit by the Jasper Daggers as well, which, you know, I mentioned previously. Even if it didn't get hit by Jasper Daggers, the fact that you're only hitting up to, you know, you're only able to silence them if you're able to hit all of their heroes at once and like no creep spawns in front of them. That's really tricky and kind of hard to fulfill. So Drow is now much worse. And the entire point of the Salamania Storm deck is to just blow them out with the silence and abuse that. So it's basically just not really a super competitive deck anymore. Still fun to play. Honestly, my opinion of the deck was it was overrated before. We'll never know if that was true or not because it got nerfed, but I think it was kind of getting carried by blue in general, and people just hadn't really built and played optimized blue lists properly up until that point. Like, I was scrimming before the tournament hyped. We did like 20 scrims mono blue versus his Storm combo deck, and he's a very good pilot for the Storm combo deck. I'm a very good pilot for mono blue, and I mean, he said he was feeling like it was like a 30% matchup for the Storm side. Like, it just felt like he was just kind of getting obliterated. And Storm didn't really have any super uniquely powerful matchups that Mono Blue couldn't sustain as well. It was maybe like 5% ahead on the red-green matchup in that situation. But it felt like it was just kind of... You could blow the opponent out, but... you're giving up too much of your early game for no reason. Anyway, that deck is now bad, regardless of whether it was bad or not before. So blue is probably the strongest color. I think mono blue is just kind of the way to go. That deck is probably just like the new thing. I'm going to go ahead and throw it up on screen here. My mono blue list. This is probably the most optimized mono blue list, and I would highly recommend it if you want to play blue. Now, blue-black might kind of arise as sort of a meta counter to this if it can be optimized properly. It's tricky because I think that unless it's built really well, it honestly doesn't seem as favored against mono blue as it otherwise should. Because mono blue kind of has the potential to just kind of lock out a game at the same turn that like the Vesture combo is sort of coming online. So it's a very, very risky counter, but it does sometimes work. And then you've got red-black, like for example, Petrify, Bot, and Seat Story, which is pretty good. I mean, you're going to be able to get, you're going to be able to kind of tank up against mono blue very well with your, Stonehall Cloaks and whatnot. And it's kind of like the new way to play this like sort of aggressive mid-rangey style deck, right? Now, nobody really knows kind of the most optimal way to build it right now, but it's slowly being tweaked. Regarding that list, Lich is a much better hero now. Lich got a huge buff. And this is the kind of thing I'm kind of talking about when I talk about meta changes and ecosystems. I mean, Lich didn't get changed directly, but armor is worse, acts as worse as a hero. Red-green ramp is less present as a color combination, right? So that was kind of the nightmare matchup for Lich because they play a little too fast for Chain Frost and they apply armor with Treant, Axe, Time of Triumph, everything else, Bristleback Legion, so much armor that you get blown out. Now, you've got maybe a more blue meta. Lich, hey, this is blue's natural predator. You have this ability that destroys armor. He's tanky, so he can survive blue spells. And the ability that destroys armor, Chain Frost, also gives initiative, which is what you need against blue. Also, he has Sacrifice, which gives you card advantage for board exchange. And against blue, you don't really want to be playing for the board in the first place. So the downside of Sacrifice is pretty mitigated. Every single thing about this hero was built to be an anti-blue card. It doesn't look at it. It doesn't look like it maybe as obviously as it does with something like Pugna, but Lich is absolutely like the Pugna of black. This is black's just super anti-blue card, and it'll do a lot better in a meta where there's just a lot less armor representation. Speaking of Pugna, hey, maybe Pugna will actually see that experimentation. We said earlier 6-0 brought in his list. He kind of got blown out, but there is potential to the idea of Pugna. He's not an inviolable card. He does, in theory, kind of hard counter what mono blue is trying to play for, and it's a card that's going to be seeing some experimentation. Red has kind of more freed up slots now that maybe Axe isn't super auto-include anymore. We'll have to see kind of how it goes out. Hell, even Bristle got nerfed because, of course, Jasper Dagger purges off Viscous Nasal Goo. So red is a color that feels kind of a good amount more flexible than before, and there's just more you can do with it, right? Then you've got Stonehall Cloak, right? Again, not directly changed, but because blue is going to be kind of the color to beat right now, mono blue decks in particular, I think are probably the single strongest deck you can find on ladder. If they're played well, that's a big if, because a lot of people are going to, make minor misplays. It's a very, very difficult deck to play perfectly. But Stonehall Cloak is a hard counter to mono blue, because they will feed you the gold for you to get the Stonehall Cloaks online early. Even if you're not playing something that farms heroes a ton, I mean, blue heroes just feed you. And if you get the Stonehall Cloaks online early, you'll be able to survive the onslaught of, the Eclipse, the Thunder God's Wrath, etc., and kind of force them out of the game on mana turns 8 or 9. Because the way to beat mono blue, you can't kill them before those tools come online, right? It's impossible. If you build an aggro deck, you're going to get blown out at any cost unless they have a bad hand. You can't reliably do it, right? So you need to tank up so that your heroes will survive when those things hit the board. And then when that happens, you just kind of close the game out. Hopefully their towers will be at low health by then. Another buff to Stonehall Cloak is that now that Jasper Daggers is 5 golds, hey, the 5 gold Stonehall Cloak as your health item to maybe replace Traveler's Cloak or Revtil Signet Ring actually has that added benefit. You obfuscate information from your opponent, and this is actually really important. When you go to buy an item and they see you've spent 5 gold on an item, the fact that they don't know whether it's Jasper or Stonehall is a really big deal, because in the mid-game turns like the mana 4, mana 5, maybe even mana 6 of the games, the fact that you don't have a health item in your hand, or the fact that your opponent doesn't know you have a health item in your hand will change how they play, right? Or maybe they don't know you have a Jasper Daggers in your hand, right? You're using 2 items, maybe even to Magic them all for a third 5 gold item, and they can't be sure which 5 gold item you bought if they're counting your gold, which just makes their plays worse. And then maybe the final thing is that Enough Magic is quite a bit better as a card now. Now that Gust is gone, these red-green decks and red-black decks are starting to maybe tech in something like 1, maybe 2 Enough Magics. It's a great way to kind of close out the game. Before, this was considered like, the poor man's Gust. Now, whoa, this is the rich man's Gust. This card is much better than Gust, not counterable by Jasper Daggers, not contingent on a specific board state setup. You just plow through them with your Enough Magic, and it's a great way to kind of close the game out against these blue decks in particular. So expect to see a lot more of that card. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Those are just my general impressions and predictions on kind of how things are going to go from now. I regret not being able to make this video like 3 days ago when it would have been more relevant, because the patch happened like 3 days ago, but I was at this event and I don't have a laptop, so what am I gonna do? Oh well. Anyway, my overall impressions are fairly positive. I'm really glad that they're willing to make changes. I'm really glad that they're willing to make buffs and not just nerfs. I think these are both good things. In terms of the specific changes they made, I'm a little concerned with some of the kind of extended as well as long-term implications for Jasper Daggers in particular, and the fact that blue kind of didn't get touched. We see, red's auto-include card and green's auto-include card got down a little bit, but blue feels like, both Ogre and Kana could see some kind of nerf. I could see Annihilation receiving some kind of nerf potentially, now that there's not, a card dedicated to sort of controlling it in that way. We'll have to see exactly how things are handled in the future, but overall it is definitely good news for the game that they're willing to make changes and taking the right approach there. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. I'll see you guys next time.